You are welcome to episode number 38 of the Voices of Boyle. In this episode, we are joined by Clive Roe. Clive shares the story of his recent research project that commemorated the 250th anniversary of the Church of Ireland. From uncovering ancient graves and the church's connections to local families, to preserving the building's heritage through a publication of a small booklet, Clive offers a fascinating glimpse into the deep roots of our small town. So join us as we delve into the stories hidden within the historic walls of the Church of Ireland. Clive, you're very, very welcome to the Voices of Boyle. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about in this episode is primarily going to be focused on the little booklet that you brought out just before Christmas, Clive, on the 250th anniversary of the Church of Ireland, which you've done a lot of research in. But before that, why don't you bring us back to the start, maybe about where you were born and where you grew up?
My history, I suppose, in Boyle goes back to my grandfather, William Roe, known as Willie. He came to Boyle in around 1905 and he was born in 1889. He was a plumber by trade. He was an apprentice plumber and he was heading towards Sligo to try and get some employment. And the train stopped in Boyle station to unload some goods, and he got talking to a guy who told him that there was work available in Sloane's repairing bicycles. So he never went on to Sligo. He stayed in Boyle and started off in the motor trade, had 6 kids, set up his life here. After that, my father and his brother Alfie both took part in the business, and then myself and Billy, the third generation. So that's my history in Boyle.
So he came to Boyle, worked in Sloane's.
Yes.
That started in the motor trade up in, obviously, Roe's garage, where people would have remembered back in
prior
the day.
to that, he was repairing bicycles. He rented various premises around the town. I believe Tom Wynn's pub was a bicycle shop at one stage where he was.
Wynn's?
In Wynn's, where the pub is today, yes. I've no proof of it. It's only what I hear from people. He also had a bicycle shop and a petrol pumps right smack bang in the middle of Main Street at the narrowest point. And only recently I've managed to get a picture going back to 1946 showing the petrol pumps.
That's right, yeah.
Up to that, I couldn't find it for the last 20 years.
Yeah, you showed me a few pictures just before we started, and I will add them into the blog post that goes with this episode, because they're fascinating to see them photos of the petrol pumps in Main Street, like you were talking about, not at Gran's like most people think.
Where Boyle Country Meets is today, right in the middle of the street.
On the kind of bend of that.
Yeah, beside Christy Wynn's.
Yeah, and also then the petrol pumps that most people would have remembered would have been up at the garage as well.
Yes, indeed. The site of the pumps remained where they were, even though there was a compulsory purchase order made on the garage to move it back 25 feet to allow a straight line for the road to go straight up to the railway station. And then over the railway bridge, then it was a natural run straight up.
Yeah, because in another of the photos you showed me, you could see there was a good bend on the Elphin Street.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes,
yeah. So
the building itself doubled and then doubled again over the years. So it started from humble beginnings, but it grew as the motor trade grew.
Yeah, and one thing I remember from seeing, like, the garage closed in the 90s, late 90s.
99.
99, okay.
Yep.
And it opened, or when did he...
1919, he signed up with Ford's. But prior to signing up with Ford's as a main dealer, he actually used to go over to Old Trafford in Manchester and buy a car and bring it back on the cattle boat. So that was how it all started.
And it was just Ford was the dealership, was it?
Yes, yeah. Ford, yeah. And of course he also had the Rally Bicycle Agency, which he had during the war as well, which was, I suppose, a great help because there was no petrol for cars.
Okay, yeah.
So he started off with bicycles and moved on to the 4 wheels.
So it was an 80-year reign.
80 years, yes, indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
And I always remember the structure of the outside of the building. It had a kind of, Emmett's as well had a similar structure. It was to cover maybe the joining of the roofs.
It is to conceal the peaked roof.
Peaked roof, right.
It gave it a better finish, shall we say, yes.
It almost looked like, the old theatres or cinemas.
Yes,
that kind of effect, yeah.
Sort of a covering over of the roof, shall we say.
So, and so you worked in the family business until...
I worked in the family business for 27 years. And then when it closed, then I was lucky enough to get a job working with Casey's in Roscommon. They opened up a new garage in Carrick-on-Shannon, and I ran that. I was with Casey's for 10 years. They got into financial difficulty and the downturn in the trade in 2009. And lucky enough, at the same time, the sales manager in Sligo retired, and I got a job there. So my reign in the trade, I suppose, is 47 years in total.
And you're now retired?
Now retired the last 4 years, yes, indeed. And enjoying it.
Yeah. And so one of your interests, obviously, I think you mentioned to me before that you were always interested in history.
Yes, always had an eye on history, but working the hours that I did, I had very little time to do anything else. So now that I'm free, I can do what I like.
Yeah. So as I mentioned at the start, you brought out a little booklet called the Church of Ireland, the Boyle Church of Ireland, and it was to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the building of the church was built in 250 years ago?
Yes, yeah. It was consecrated 250 years. It took, shall we say, from 1765 when it was first mooted to move it from Asselin up onto the green. From 1765 to 1773 is how long it took to actually go through everything and build it.
Okay. So maybe tell us a little on why and how you got interested in, doing a bit of research or even thinking about bringing out. Initially, you thought it might be a 1 page or a little summary or something. I remember you talking.
It started off that I noticed from the numbers that the church was 250 years old. It was by chance that I came across it. And all of a sudden I said, maybe there's a little something there. So I began to look at various bits and pieces regarding the church and the building. So we decided to try and do something for its 250th anniversary. So we started a project to try and repair the old organ that's in it, which is over 150 years old, seemingly very rare. So we started off with a fundraiser with the Solstice Choir, and people rallied around, gave us donations, one thing and the other. And finally we received enough money from the county council and put it all together, and we carried out a restoration which is now complete, and it's fabulous. So I thought I'd put a 1-page A4 together and hand it out at the anniversary service. Little did I know that it turned into 24 pages, because as I researched more about the organ, I found out more about the actual building, the church, social history, the background to it all. So I jotted down a few more bits and pieces, and all of a sudden I had a booklet.
That's great. And I read it, and there's great information about the background, as you said. Where did I remember reading, I can't remember, but where did the organ originate from?
Well, the organ came to us secondhand from Christ Church Cathedral in Derry. And because of the upgrading of their machine, they had this for sale. So we took it on and we put it into our church. So it's actually very, very old. It's unique.
Yeah. And I know nothing about organs, pianos, anything like that. But is there anything of interest about that organ? Was there a specific make or?
The company that made it is a company called Telford and Telford. They're a UK-based company, but they had offices in Dublin. And they were one of the primary makers of church organs at the time. Organs were not only in church, people had them in their houses and all sorts of public venues. It was a way of making music.
Okay. Even though it's a big...
Oh yes, but smaller versions of it.
Versions,
yes, yeah. So when you think that the version that we have was replaced by a much bigger one in Derry, so obviously the organ that they have, it must be much superior to this one.
Yeah. And so that got restored as part... When was the restoration on the organ finished?
It's just been finished just before Christmas.
Just in time?
Just in time for, shall we say, our service that we had at the end of the year. Our Harvest Festival incorporated this organ as well. So our rector, who's an accomplished musician, he played at the anniversary service and he played the organ. So it sounds fantastic.
That's great. And there was also a number of renovations carried out over the years on the church. I presume.
Yes, going back many, many, many years, the recordings of, shall we say, the minutes of various meetings all stem to one side: repair the church. It's
Right.
been a constant cost. The size of the building and the roof and the entire building is just so old.
Yeah.
Like built in 1765, like between damp and roof timbers and one thing and the other. And then, of course, you have the battlements on the top of the tower, all this causing trouble.
Yeah.
Any storm or wind or whatever, it was always, what do we have to repair the roof? You know, that was it.
Right.
It's a windswept place.
Yeah, and isn't it because of the height of the roof or the steeple? Isn't there a radio has a
Shannon's Side have a
Shannon's
mass
Side.
fitted there now, yes. And in fact, internally in the entrance to the church, there's a stone staircase that leads right up to the very, very, very top, a winding staircase made from stone.
And that's accessible. Can anyone still go up there? Obviously not anyone, but
Yes, that's how Shannon's Side get the aerial up.
oh really?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were able to send a man up on top and then drop down a rope and pull up the aerial.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the graves that, I mean, it's an old graveyard as well. What would be the oldest? Would you?
The oldest known grave that we've come across, the first burial, was from 1774. It was a Reverend John Byrne, who was the rector, or vicar as they called him in the day, from Kilcorky, which is Balnagar, just outside French Park. That church is long closed, but there's still an old burial ground there. So he's the oldest that we have, and I've actually located his grave.
Oh, you have?
I have, yes. Yeah,
right.
I've located the grave. There's a huge amount of people buried there, especially during famine times, because there's no record of these people. Maybe in name, yes, because I have over 1,000 names recorded now on a database. So
just from that graveyard?
From that graveyard alone, yes, yeah. Now, the late Sandra McCrann did a huge amount of work on this, and thankfully she recorded a lot of it manually that I was able to transcribe onto digital form, and now I'm trying to put it all together.
Brilliant. So that's leading into the next project.
That's sort of taken over now at the moment, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So between that and the plaques and a certain amount of old history, there's new things coming up all the time. In fact, one of the things that I've recently found, and that I've been talking to Thomas Campbell, who's the historian with King House, and even though the books that are produced locally all say that they're buried in the vault in the Abbey, I beg to differ on a number of occasions. We've recorded a lot of people who are buried there who are not, shall we say, buried in the Abbey as previously thought. So proof is one thing and folklore is another, but I've come up with the death entry for several of the King family. In fact, I'm up to 7 now buried in a vault underneath the church, underneath where the communion table is in the church, and that's accessible from behind the church. There's an underground vault there.
And so behind the church, I've been up there a few times taking photographs, and there's almost like a hut, if you like, but that it's blocked off. Is that relating to it, where you can go down in, and would that bring you underneath the church then? It's from the back of the east side.
No, this is actually underneath the fabric of the building itself, underneath the stained glass windows at the very back of the church.
And there is an access point
there? There is indeed, yes, underneath.
Okay.
Now, many years ago, the tomb was raided because I believe that they were looking for the ceremonial, possible, shall we say, ceremonial sword and crown that an earl would have had at the time when he was buried. But they have all disappeared. So the Egan brothers, Pat and Jim, bricked it up and plastered it up, and it's been closed ever since. But prior to that, you could actually look into it. And in fact, Dick McGee took some pictures of it. One of them is in my book.
That's right. You can just make out
You can barely make it out, but bearing in mind that you have to put your hand in through the window and a torch in one hand, and then maybe a week or 2 weeks later, the pictures came back from the lab. Then you only knew whether you got anything or not. And not like today, you could take a dozen photographs in a second. That was the way it was at the time.
That's right, yeah. I can just see the photo here.
The vault is closed over. But I've done quite a lot of research on various bits and pieces, and there are some huge plaques in the church, some of them over 20 foot tall. But the most old grave in the whole place is that of the Lord Kingston, and he was buried on November the 16th, 1797. And I have been to the church library and got my hands on some of the old recording books of births, marriages and deaths. And in this particular one, he says, buried the Lord Kingston, than whom no person was more to be esteemed or more to be lamented. Now that's entered into our burial book in the church. So that would lead me to believe that he's actually buried underneath the church.
Okay. And prior to your kind of investigations and research into that, would it have been known that that was the case about him?
Well, we always knew it as the King family vault, but it's referred to, shall we say, in various places as the vault underneath the church, even going back to Dalton's book in the 1800s. He refers to it, that there was a family vault there. And even though we'd be in church most Sundays, you see things, but you don't actually see things.
Yeah.
So in this particular picture of the vault I'll show you now, it says, in a vault near this lie the remains of the best of fathers and of men, Edward, 1st Earl of Kingston. So that's just right in front of everybody as you sit there. If you've been at any of the musical productions during the Arts Week, you'll see that sitting there. Now, we all look at it, but do we read it?
But that's it. We see, but we don't observe, as they say. Yeah. Very interesting.
All of the bits and pieces that I would have had, they're all to do with records from the church library. And they all show the various bits of pieces proving that he's buried in the church.
Yeah.
So I've had some chats with the librarian in town here as well, looking back over all bits and pieces. But it seems to be not known locally that there's so many of them actually buried there. Now, I came across Google, of course, Google Books, Lost Books, all sorts of various things that I was looking at, court journals and one thing and the other. And I'll just read you a little passage here.
Sure.
The funeral of Lord Lorton. His lordship was interred on Saturday morning last in the church of Boyle at the very early hour of 4 o'clock in the morning, it being long the custom of this family to be buried by night. After the remains were brought into the church, which was hung in black, a profound silence of several minutes reigned through the edifice. Then the Reverend William Digby commenced the service, assisted by Reverend Hunt, who read the lesson. His lordship's remains were then conveyed to the vault and laid beside those of the sainted lady of Viscountess Lorton. So that would lead me to believe that he was brought from the church to the vault underneath. It says, in the same vault lie the remains of the 1st Earl of and Countess of Kingston, so that would be the Earl and his wife, his lordship's grandfather and grandmother, 2 daughters of his lordship's, the Honourable Eleanor and Honourable Louisa King, they both died young, and also an infant child of the Honourable King Harman. Now, that was the King Harman family from Newcastle and Longford, so they might have been visiting at the time, I don't know, I can only surmise. Then it gives a list of people who attended the funeral. So it would lead me to believe that there's at least 7 known buried there.
Based on that, yeah.
Based on that, yes, yeah. Now I have the death information or burial information, and actually 4 of them. So it's just a little tangent that I've been on since writing the book, just digging out more and more and more of who's actually there. So that seems to be the way it is. Of course, they were intermarried with the King family who built Mitchelstown Castle. So many of them would have been in one place or the other. So there's also a family trail down there and a family vault as well.
Okay, yeah. It sounds like, just from talking to you as well, like you're passionate about this kind of stuff as well.
It's just interesting to see because I suppose I have time on my hands now to do all this bit of research. But it's, one thing leads to the other.
It does, because as well as, okay, you have time in your hands, but not everyone would have an interest in doing projects like this. And I think they're brilliant for the town to have, because, you know, how many other buildings out there that would have their own story, just like the Church of Ireland, you know, obviously the Abbey, King House, they're all independent, and I know some of them have been covered, but, you know, it's great that we now have a nice little booklet with kind of factual information in it.
Yes, well, it's a case, I suppose, that the King family were so influential in the area. They were the people, shall we say, and everything seemed to revolve around the big house, as it was known. So the fact of where they're buried, everybody presumed it was in the Abbey, because the King family, when they came to this area, first of all, actually lived in Boyle Abbey. And then they were buried within the walls of Boyle Abbey. There was actually a church there as well. So needless to say that the family, shall we say, when you go looking at it, they didn't live as long as we live today. Every 20, 30, 40 years, there was another new king taking over the family business. So that was actually unique in the time. But when you're looking at Robert, Edward, for example, then you have the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and so on. Why they kept calling them the same leads to a very confusing trail sometimes. You think you've got somebody and, oh no, it's a
different Edward.
Different Edward, yeah. But that's the way it was.
Yeah.
So the business going on at the moment of trying to put this all on a digital form, due to the late Sandra McCrann and Yvonne Halton, and of course Cyril Mattimo, which is a colonel. He was a recruiter in the army in the years gone by, who was also an interested historian. I've gathered a lot of these works together to try and compile the latest, shall we say, effort at putting something together regarding the list of the graves.
Yeah.
So tying up the plaques on the wall with people who were interred and trying to find something about it. But of course, a lot of it was lost in 1922. When many of our recording books were sent back and they were lost in the Civil War 22.
Yeah. You mentioned Cyril Mattimo there. He also has a book, hasn't he, on the North Roscommon history?
Yes, yeah. Indeed. He was somebody who was also interested in history.
Yeah,
yes,
that's right. And okay, so with all the research you've done for the Church of Ireland, was there any points of interest that fascinated you more than others? Like, for example, finding out that there was, the maybe the evidence that shows that there was 7 of the king, was it kings?
King family, yes.
That were buried underneath. Yeah. Like, what would be your kind of standout that really fascinated you the most?
Well, I suppose the actual introduction of that building into the area. I got my hands on the original vestry book going back to 1765. Now, the vestry book is a book which we enter in all our business, shall we say, the happenings of whatever meetings that we have to discuss and all the rest of it. So going back to 1765, I actually got my hands on the original book in the Church Library in Dublin. And that led from one thing to another. There's a whole lot of fascinating entries and one thing and the other. But it just goes to show as well the social fabric that was around at the time. It wasn't just about buildings and windows and one thing and the other, of which there are some beautiful stained glass windows. But also it shows like what happened, why did it happen, what was life like at the time. Like, to think that if you went up on a Sunday morning and there was children attached to the railings of the gate, these children were known as foundlings. They had been abandoned by their parents during hard times. They couldn't afford to feed them. So the church undertook to both feed and educate and try and bring these people to a stage in life that they could look after themselves. So there's a lot of social history. It's not just about a building. A whole lot went on in the town. And when you look back and see what was done, the town is what it is because of who was there before us. Like, when you're reading things like when the Crescent was built, and there was, of course, the courthouse, which is known as a sessions house and things like that. It all goes to show that at the time when the King family came to Boyle, not only were they landlords per se, but they were also, I suppose, forward thinking as far as bringing a form of business and structure to the town. And the town grew up around that. So I suppose we have a lot to be thankful for as we look back on where we came from. That's really it.
So you said those children were
called foundlings. Foundlings, yes. Okay. Yeah. It was a term that was used for children that were found at the church. It was common in the day that they would be found at church gates. They would be found at a doctor's doorstep. They'd be found at an infirmary, which was a hospital at the time. They were left where they would be found, yes. Right. And the hope that they would be taken over by somebody who would take care of them.
Okay.
It was a strange time, but then we've gone through several famines, not just the big famine of the 1840s.
The
famines,
1700s as well, wasn't
yeah,
there?
and there's famines in the early 1800s as well, where people had very little. In fact, when you look back at the history of the town, it was, I suppose, a struggle in most people's lives to put food on the table and put something in the fire. Heat and food were the basic necessities, and it was tough going.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of little bits and pieces that I came across in the book, and of course, it became of interest because one thing led to the other. And
snowballed.
As history moves, you never know it all. You'll know a little bit about a lot of things.
But it's great that you have it down in a little, short format booklet like that, because it's not as intimidating to someone, because a lot of people in this town, myself included, wouldn't have a great knowledge or history about the Church of Ireland, but to have something that's 24 pages,
yes,
bite-sized.
It's a history of a building, and I suppose the Boyle history as well. Yeah,
and it ties in lovely, and it's a great thing to have.
And thanks to Carlo for your lovely nighttime photograph taken.
You're welcome.
Yeah. It looks very, very good. A lot of people comment on it. Yeah.
No, it's I think it adds to it. It's a nice photo of that. But and thanks very much for asking to use it. It was a pleasure.
Not at all. Yes.
But and is it who the back photo on the back cover?
My daughter Shelley took this with a drone there at the end of last summer as well to just show what it looks like today. So it's a front and back cover of the church building itself. Yeah.
Now that roof looks just looking at the back of the cover and the back, the roof looks to have been done recently.
As I said at the introduction, we have had problems with the roof from day one.
Oh, right.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So a whole lot of damp was coming into the church, and I suppose, like everything else, it was a huge undertaking. But it is one of the oldest buildings in the town, so it's not just a church roof, it's a roof on a building which is part of Boyle. 250 years part of Boyle.
Yeah.
But the damp was appearing through the walls, and we carried out an extensive survey, and the report showed that a vast amount of work had to be done. So way back in 2014, the late Michael Archer oversaw a restoration project, and that was built by Joe Sweeney and Sons, neighbours of yours, I believe.
Yes, just at the road here.
Yeah. So a conservation assessment had to be carried out. Hamilton Young Architects in Sligo were appointed, and it led to a complete dismantling of the roof, and a whole new roof had to be fitted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So hopefully for the next 100 years or so, we'll have a roof on it anyway and keep out the damp.
Yeah. And you mentioned there about one of the oldest buildings in Boyle. What is the oldest building in Boyle? People like myself used to think it was the Abbey, but I think there was a church up at Ashlyn built by St. Columkill, isn't it? 600 years prior to the Abbey being built.
Yes, indeed.
So would that be...
That would be, but there is no building there now today. I suppose the oldest...
there is a bit of a wall
left. Of a wall, yes, yeah.
But would that be, the church up there would have been the first building?
It was the first, shall we say, Christian building built in the town.
Mm.
But the oldest actually occupied building would be, I think, Frybrook, I think, is the oldest, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The Frys came to Ireland at the request of the kings, who were at that time living in the Abbey, to bring some flax production to the town and to the area. So that's how they started off in town. And in fact, there's a mausoleum to the Frys. A mausoleum is the same thing as a family vault, but a mausoleum is above ground, whereas a vault is below ground.
Right.
Yeah. So they have one there. There's a few of them to the left as you enter. But that's where the Christian, shall we say, church first started off, was in the parish of Asylin. And Asylin is another name for Boyle at the time, according to what I could see. I read the Annals of Lockheed and the Annals of Boyle.
You've read them books?
Yeah.
What are they? I'd say, I would presume they're difficult enough to read unless you're into your history.
They are, because there's maybe 1 year, there might be one line. A terrible frost this year, which lasted until the summer. And then famine was in the land the following year. And that's all they'd say about it. Not the tens of thousands of people that maybe died from it all.
Right.
So when you look back, you'd see in 1739, 1741, around that period, there was severe snow and frost. There was a massive famine, and 500,000 people died of the cold and starvation. This is known as the Great Slaughter in its time.
That was the famine around the 1700s.
1739, 1741, yeah.
Okay. And who wrote those books, the Annals of Lough, and is it...
Well, going back to the abbey again, there was an abbey house or a church house built on the island, Trinity Island, just off, as we'd know today, in Lough, just off Rockingham. Easily accessible by boat, good structure. It has been extensively repaired by the Board of Works over the years. So it's very visible and it's a huge structure. And then, of course, even older than that, there's like a small church then on Church Island. And that's accessible, but you have to just get in, rent the boat on a Sunday and just go out and have a look.
And was it monks that wrote the...
Yes.
Yeah.
The monks that were in Boyle Abbey, they also had a branch that built this church on Trinity Island. And it's there, I believe, that they had their scholars writing these entries into the book every year. So it meant that there was a recorded history going back in a long, long, long time.
And what would your take be, Clive, on the supposed tunnels that are going from, I think, the Abbey to Assilin? There's talk of other underground...
There's talk of 3 tunnels.
Yeah.
From Boyle to Assilin, to the graveyard. There's from Boyle to Dunamis.
Dunamis?
Yes, that's up at the top of Great Meadow.
Right.
Where you turn left to go up to Roscommon. Yeah. And in fact, talking to some of the older people around town, they said that when the railway was being prepared and built at the time, back in the 1860s, coming through Boyle, that they actually intersected that. So there's rumour that if you walk along by the railway from the station towards the Dublin direction, that you'll come across the entrance to what looks like a cave. I've never done it, but that's what some people say.
And would these tunnels be kind of consistent in towns that have abbeys as well? Because obviously an abbey is something that would lend itself to, as we know, a history going way back, that there would be maybe possibilities of tunnels. So, for example, in other towns around that have an abbey, would there have been talk of tunnels in those towns too?
That I don't know, but the idea of the tunnel was to make a quick escape, because all the religious goods were so valuable at the time that they were all handmade and very unique. And what the monks used to do is that have their writings, for example, the annals, and all their clerical use, they would bring these to a safe place, out of the way, so that have an escape in 3 directions, depending on where the attack was coming from.
Right.
So that was the idea of the tunnels.
Because I do remember hearing back when the council were doing some work outside of Scanlon's pub here in town, just at the bridge, that they exposed some of the ground there, and there was supposedly, you could see into a tunnel that went under what looked like under the river towards the direction of Assilin. Okay. I don't know how true that is, but I always heard that. I'd like to get in more information about that, because it would be interesting to know.
Well, the rumour that I heard was that one went from the Abbey at the back of Main Street.
Right.
In the direction, then you didn't have to go under the river, because you were that side, you were the north side all the way from the Abbey all the way to Assilin. So, see, Assilin goes back so far. It's mentioned back in, as the saying goes, the 600s. It's back to St. Patrick, really, if you want to go back that far. And that's really where the clerical side of Christianity came, was from St. Patrick. And as we know, Boyle has a huge association with St. Patrick. We have the well just on the edge of town, everything around and about it. And St. Patrick's assistant at the time, St. Attracta, there's a huge amount of churches and wells dedicated to St. Attracta as well. So they were both in the area at the time. In fact, they say that St. Patrick visited this area twice. So when we look at shall we say, there was a village there at the time before King House was built, and that's where the old ecclesiastical situation in Boyle first started off. That's where the church started off. So there's still a huge amount of, shall we say, interest in Assilin, and even the fact going back on old maps, which I was lucky enough to be able to see one time, there's a map showing where the late Dr. Bernard Maguire is living there now, out the Felton Road.
That's right. Yeah.
The lands where his house is built is actually known as Glebe lands. And his house he called the Glebe.
Right.
So that laid weight to the fact that there was a church there, because a glebe was a portion of land given to a rector at the time to allow him to live on to grow food. So that's what a glebe land was originally. It was land surrounding a church. It's still on the maps today.
And would you have an interest in them all maps?
You'll always see something new. And that's the thing about it. You always see something new.
Yeah.
Like all the people that drive in the entrance to Lough Forest Park today, the entrance that we have today is the modern entrance. Whereas if you go down 100 yards past Kelly's house and you see the entrance, that was the old gate lodge that looks like the Tiara. That's what they call the Tiara Lodge. That was the entrance from the Dublin Road. And people drive past that every day. It's the entrance to Maura Keaveney's house. And if you look at that, that is the old entrance to Lough Forest Park from the Carrick Road.
Oh.
So that was the Rockingham entrance. And you need to stand up and look at it and realise that the Tiara house that's there is actually the gate lodge facing to where the coaches would come into the house.
Yeah, not many people would have known that.
No, because they're looking where the traffic is to turn right to go into the modern day entrance. Whereas if you stand up on the old entrance, it's only 100 yards, 100 metres just on the Carrick side. You'll see fabulous cut stone and this terrific looking Tiara Lodge. That's why it's called the Tiara Lodge. It looks like a tiara, a headpiece.
So much would be buried underneath this as well. That we wouldn't even know.
In the rush and bustle of daily life, we see things too late. You know, they're gone when we suddenly realise, oh, that should have been kept. Like King House.
Yes.
That was such a tragedy to have that removed in rubble at the time.
Yeah, because they were thinking of making that into a car park or something, wasn't it?
Well, the King House was supposed to be destroyed at one stage for a car park, but that thankfully was rescued by the county council, and I believe they put a fortune of money into it. I don't know, will it ever be known what it cost? But anyway, the work is there for us all to see today, which is terrific. Yeah.
That's right. Connie Fallon as well would have been instrumental in that, getting that prevented from being turned into a car park.
Yes, yeah. But it was a disused, crumbling building at the time. It was,
because I even remember as a kid playing with the Conor and Micheál Boyle there.
Yeah.
At the barracks, it was just a shell.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
So
McNamara's had a coal yard in it there for a while as well. Yes. Yeah.
But even the getting back to like stuff being buried underneath us, like the Abbey. When we drive along by the Abbey, we're elevated. Whereas the ground that was all filled in, elevated over the years. No one knows what's underneath that. Like, if you if you go down to the actual level of the Abbey itself, there may be, 10 feet, 15 feet higher.
Well, coming in from the Dublin side over the years, the main road coming into Boyle was from the Carrick and Shannon side, coming into town, and you stopped at the river to turn left along at the Convent Gate as we know today, and in past the post office, and then you turned right. So the main road to Sligo went straight up the curlews known as the Mail Coach Road. That was the way out of town. Or you turned left and you went to the Gurteen Tubbercurry side of town, or Ballymote, onto Sligo. So the entrance then to Boyle was taken one step further with its first bypass when the building of a bridge just at the Convent Gate. That's a bridge that was built in the early 1800s. And that was the first bypass of town.
That's right. That's written on one of the signs there, that it was one of the first in Ireland.
And prior to that, of course, the only bridge then in town was the Abbeytown Bridge, which itself is going back to the 1200s.
The oldest stone bridge in Ireland, I think.
They say one of the, yes.
Yeah.
So it's actually made without any masonry. It's actually a loose stone bridge.
And so I read somewhere, or I remember reading ages ago, that bridge, the stone bridge in Abbeytown, was also one of the first instances of a toll system in Ireland, because that used to connect Lough to the town. And only people that had money were going to and from. So the monks used to charge a toll to the carriages that used to go there.
That was the main entrance to the town at the time.
Yeah.
There was no other crossing of the Boyle River.
So there was a toll system in place there, which I'd love to get more information on that too. That'd be fascinating.
Well, thanks to a little bit more of the research I did, I came across a book in the library, and in it there's a picture of the old bridge and a small discussion on it by the late Richard McGee. And it actually shows the uprights of the toll gates on the bridge.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's where I probably have came across it. If Richard
I'll send that to you
after
this. Yeah.
That'd be brilliant.
Again, you can attach it to it because it's a little bit of local history, a bit of interest. Yeah.
It is, again, and not many people would know that either.
No, and the bridge is the same width as it was back then. And to think of all the tonnage of stuff that it has brought over the years, and it's still standing up.
And the construction of it,
it's terrific.
To break the water, that you have that kind of triangle shape.
Yes, there's an angle for what they call a breakwater.
Right.
On the upper side of the river, and of course there's none on the lower side because the water just dissipates.
Yeah.
It's just to break the water to stop undermining the foundation.
Yeah. It's just we're so lucky in this town. We keep saying it over and again, but we have so much history in this town.
We have so much history. But the biggest problem about anything to do with history, it's only if somebody writes it down or takes a photograph. And thankfully, Dick McGee, who was
way ahead of his time,
a master at the camera, he recorded so many things that are now forgotten.
Yeah.
But then in the hustle and bustle of life, a lot of people don't have time to stop and think and just look around them and see what have we got under our feet.
And I suppose with Richard as well, a lot of his photos, his son Brendan was telling me as well, haven't been developed. And as you said, with the hustle and bustle of life, if you don't get around to processing images, they can become forgotten about almost.
When I was younger, you had a roll of film in your camera, and then when it was done, you got it developed. You kept those pictures in a shoebox or a tin or wherever you kept them. Now today, we've thousands and thousands of photographs on our phone, and we don't print one.
That's and what happens there is then
it is lost.
It is lost,
yes,
and that's the sad thing about everything being digital is we're not backing things up properly.
Yes, well,
unfortunately,
this is where everything is just lost.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
With photographs, especially maybe in Dick McGee's era, when he was taking them photos, they're not priceless then and there. It's only with the advancement of time they are. Yeah, so Brendan obviously has a lot of undeveloped photos, he was saying, of his dad. So he said hopefully he'll get around to doing that soon because there obviously must be a lot of them.
Oh yes, and as time goes by, they do decay because the print, the format that they were stored on decays.
They do, unfortunately. Any other interests kind of for similar projects, not even maybe locally, but would there be any other projects, Clive, that you'd like to get your teeth into?
Well, I didn't know I was getting into this one.
Yeah, but you did, and you got into it in a big way.
I sort of slid into it. As I mentioned earlier, the late Sander McCrann did a huge amount of work, and I'm trying to put a lot of that now together. It's slow going because the entry with one finger as I type
takes its time.
It takes its time, yes, yeah. But I'm enjoying it, and I'm getting around to just reading a little bit more as I go along and finding another tangent. The amount of rabbit holes you can go down, you can spend a week looking to see where somebody was buried, and to suddenly find that you look at an old English newspaper that I've got access to, and you find that they died in London or whatever. So you'll be chasing them between Boyle and Mitchelstown to see where the member of the King family was buried, to find that they're not here in Ireland at all. They've moved back to England.
Yeah.
So things like that. But it's all in the fun.
Yeah, it is. It's a fascinating.
So I've no plans for any further.
Not yet.
But I hadn't a plan for this, as all
exactly.
But I'm just chipping away at it.
And how long did it take you to kind of, from maybe when you set out to do the one-page booklet, how long did it take you to complete?
Well, I suppose the summer came in between. I tend to do a lot of this in the darker evenings when you have more time, and there's only so much TV that you can watch, and Netflix and one thing and the other. So I just chip away at this. But I'd say it's best part of 6 months.
Yeah.
I suppose the highlight was getting the original vestry books going back to 1765. They were what I would call the basis of an awful lot of this, because I was able to go back and just read them all When I went to the church library, of course, I didn't have time to read it all. The writing was somewhat difficult to read, and the letter S is written as an F, so you're constantly just reading something and rereading it a couple of times to make sense. So what I decided to do, I just took out my iPad and I photographed every page. So I photographed hundreds of pages. So I was able to come back home then and cast them to the TV and actually read them in a bigger format, which meant that I could actually see it much, much better.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
Yeah. And the book was launched then, was it as part of the
250th anniversary, yes.
Right,
yeah.
Up in the actual church.
In the church itself, yes. The bishop came that day, and we were joined by the school kids. They had a little feature, and also the Boyle choir, the church choir, came along and sang as well. So it was a very enjoyable day.
And how many copies? I know you mentioned you have a few copies left of the initial batch run.
There was a good run over Christmas as well, and actually, I don't know whether I should do another rerun, but I've sold over 300 at the moment.
Yeah,
which in a small town, I suppose.
Well, it is, and it's on a niche subject as well.
Yes, a niche subject. Yes. One of the things that I would associate the church with at the time, of course, is that it's not the same building today as it was built the first day. The two wings that are on the church that make a cruciform, they were actually put on in the 1800s when there was a lot of the army were going to the Church of Ireland in Boyle, and upwards of 400 people could be at a church service on a Sunday. Now we're struggling 25 on a Sunday. So it just goes to show the amount of interest in everything's church today has diminished.
And what would you attribute the decline? I know this is just, I think, across the board, but what would you kind of attribute the decline on people going to church these days?
Everybody is just in a huge rush.
Yeah.
Going nowhere but in a rush to get there.
Yeah. And would you have thought the COVID era would have affected
COVID
that too?
didn't help, certainly, because again, people, I have friends in London who anytime they're home, they will always go to Canon Jerry's church service in the Catholic Church here in Boyle. Mm-hmm. And I know for a fact that they don't go to the church, their local Catholic church in London. But what they do is they log on to his service, and she's walking around the house doing her jobs and she's listening to the church service. So it's another way of doing. You don't have to go and actually physically be there, but you can be there in mind and spirit without actually attending. So I think that has taken on a big...
and would you view that as, I know it's progression?
It's part of the decline. It's not that people aren't going to church. In their minds they are, but they might not physically be attending. And the demise of all churches at the moment, as the old saying goes, church mass or meeting seems to have diminished greatly. And I suppose it's a sign of the times that people are now more educated. They're questioning things. They have their own minds to make up. They're not being told what to do nowadays. They're making up their own minds. So that's part of it all. But we can see it ourselves. Online services now are the norm, and loads of people have not come back to the church. So the church loses out financially as well, because donations keep the doors open, and without donations, doors close.
That's it. And I think
it's donations and vocations.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that would slowly over the years, as things get more and more online focused, that could lead to the demise of like these old churches, as you said.
Of course.
The doors can't be kept open.
No, it all costs money.
Yeah.
But when you look at the church today, any church, any faith, you go to the church, it tends to be older people who are there. The youth are not there following on. So this is a decline. We can see it everywhere we go.
And if that was to continue then in another generation or two, you're talking about
wipeout.
Yeah, no
absolutely nobody going. And the cost of keeping these buildings together, both structurally, heat, light, and of course insurance and things like that, it all adds up.
And then you would also have to think, if that was the case, that no one was physically going, the generation of age when in the future, that they won't bother with the online side either.
It is slowly declining, but it's a steady decline. Yes.
Yeah. I always like to finish off, Clive, by asking, is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered? Is there any other topics?
Well, just to continue on with the decline of the church, in one way, the decline is steady. But on the other side, people are more prepared to use their churches for other things. For example, we have a great association going on nearly 20 years now with Boyle Arts Festival. So you will see that a lot of people now are using their churches, the building of the church, and they're not afraid to have all forms of theatre, live music, whatever. And this brings people to a new space. And possibly then, if we were able to develop that in a broader sense to create more income, well, then possibly then the building will no longer be a church as such. It'll always be a church building, but as such that people will be able to keep the building going, and therefore the structure will be able to survive.
That's right, because you recently also had Tommy Fleming had a concert in the
Catholic Church here in town, yes.
Yeah, which again leads to what you were saying. Maybe it's another way of keeping the doors open.
Yes, and using the space, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, my centrefold of the little booklet that I wrote shows Donal and Dots O'Connor at the Arts Festival production in 2023. And
that's right, yeah.
The amount of people that have actually referred that picture back to me and said, it's a stunning picture.
It is, because you have the colours. I don't know who took that. Was it Enda Regan or?
It was actually Veronica O'Connor.
Was it Veronica?
Yes.
Okay, right. Yeah, I think it's a stunning photo because you've got the colours, you've got the intimate crowd there.
Yes, it just shows what a good performance space it is.
And two local talented musicians as well in the centrepiece.
So it's just another use for a building.
Thank you very, very much for your time. Appreciate
Not at all.
you
I hope
coming out.
This is of interest to somebody.
Oh, it will be, absolutely. Again, it's another piece of history that we haven't touched on, especially about the church. So thank you very much for your time, Clive.
Thank you, Carlo.